Talk Radio.
Inspiration, brave action, and heartwarming journeys. This is what the Louise H. Reed Show brings you. Now, here's your host, Louise H. Reed.
Hello. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me this wonderful Tuesday. I'm your host, Louise H. Reed. With listeners in over 145 countries and millions of iTunes downloads and ongoing podcasts each month, I'm the fortunate host here every Tuesday at this time to explore the incredible journey of amazing people who've truly embraced the notion of taking brave, bold action. Before I introduce you to today's guest, I'd like to remind you that after today's show, you can download, show information about myself, about today's guest, from my webpage, louisehreed.com. So I'm really excited today, and I have to say, I was mentioning to Mike before we hopped on the call today, I'm nervous for some reason today, and I'm sharing that because sometimes, when you're just really vulnerable and open and you can say how you're feeling, it sometimes can put those nerves at ease. So that's what I'm counting on by being open and vulnerable right now. So friends, everyone here who listens regularly knows that I'm totally fascinated in people's journeys and backstories, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Mike Robbins. So let me tell you a little bit about Mike. We'll welcome him to the show and we'll dive right into it. So Mike is the author of 4 books: Focus on the Good Stuff, Be Yourself, Everyone Else is Already Taken, Nothing Changes Until You Do, and Bring Your Whole Self to Work. He's a former pro baseball player whose playing career ended due to an injury. For the past 17 years, he's been a sought-after motivational speaker who delivers keynotes and seminars for some of the top companies in the world, including Google, Wells Fargo, Microsoft, Schwab, eBay, and the San Francisco Giants. He and his work have been featured in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, as well as on ABC News and the Oprah Radio Network. He was a regular contributor to the Huffington Post for a decade, and his books have been translated into 15 different languages. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, thanks, Louise. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I mean, I hardly know where to start. The beginning of the show with an hour ahead of us, I feel like we've got so much opportunity to explore. But the show, as it does every week, goes by so quickly.
Yeah.
So you are a podcaster as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from what I've listened to some of your podcasts is that you too like to explore a behind the scenes sort of approach to the people that you interview. So let's just tell us a little bit about you in that regard. Like, why are you interested in that aspect of people, and why is that important?
Well, I've always been, I appreciated you opening by saying that you felt nervous because, for me, a lot of my life growing up, and even still now, whether it was in school or, as you mentioned, I played baseball for many years, or now, whether it's my podcast or being here on an interview with you or getting up on stage to speak, it's like, I know what it feels like inside my own body, inside my own head. And for much of my life, particularly when I was young, I thought I was crazy, right? I would feel that sense of anxiety or that sense of doubt or fear, insecurity, and look around at other people. And most people didn't look as nervous as I felt. So I just thought I was weird, right? I think this is like a human experience. And as I got to be a little bit older and I started to get more curious and I started to open up a little bit more myself, as I started to listen to people and people would share honestly, openly, vulnerably with me, I realized, oh, everybody's experiencing that. I was literally just this morning watching an interview with Michelle Obama, the former First Lady of the US here, and she's got a brand new book that just came out. And she was talking about not only feeling nervous about her book coming out, but all the times in the White House and throughout the course of her life that she felt nervous or not sure if she was good enough. And I'm thinking to myself, like, she's incredibly successful and poised and has been all over the world. And so to hear that story from her, it's just like anybody else. I'm fascinated by people's stories and journeys, but I'm also fascinated by people's doubts and fears and insecurities, both because I think it makes us all human and connected, but also, quite frankly, it makes me feel better about myself that I'm not so crazy.
All so true, like so much yes and all of that. And interestingly, that's why I started this journey myself of having my own radio show, was because I think it's so easy for us, we compare our insides to other people's outsides.
Yeah.
And with social media being what it is, it can be put to good use, but we also recognize some of the negative impacts, and it's that comparing to others and that judging of others. So I love to explore people's stories of resilience, because that it really does showcase how, to your point, we are all human. It's interesting how we all go through similar phases of life. We go through similar sorts of milestones, and yet there's no journey that's the same.
Right. Well, and what's interesting about that, one of the things that I've learned over the years in my own work, and I think about this with respect to even, you and I connecting here or talking to people about their stories or their journeys, is I love the saying that the more personal, the more universal. So the more personal we're willing to be about ourselves and our lives and our journeys and our stories and our feelings and what's going on, even though, people might look at me and you just as an example and think, well, I'm male and you're female. Well, you live in Canada, and I think you said you're from England originally, right? And I'm here in California, and, you have boys, I have girls. And I mean, we could go through these different things, all the things that make us different. And I'm sure there's lots of aspects of our lives and our journeys and our stories that are very different. But as we start to tell our stories more personally, more genuinely, more authentically, it's like, oh, wow, how come we can somehow relate to each other? And it's not because we necessarily look the same or we have the same background or the same experiences, is because the further down below the waterline, I like to say, on the iceberg that we go, the more universal things become, the more we just get down to some basic human emotions and experiences, hopes and dreams, fears and doubts. And then that becomes an easier way for us to connect and relate to each other. And a lot of my work and all the books that I've written and most of the workshops and speeches that I deliver are really trying to inspire people, including myself, to how can we be vulnerable and real with each other like that as a way to connect more deeply with each other.
I can't believe we've jumped into this so quickly. I mean, I absolutely love it. It's just like the depth is just, we've just sunk right in. I just poked my head down to grab something that was right beside me, because what you were just talking about reminded me of a challenge that I'm participating in. I'm always, I'm a coach, and I think that it's important for me, for my own clients, to make sure that I continue on my own growth and development. And so I'm doing a holiday challenge with another coach.
Nice.
And today's challenge was about something called soul gazing. And it's about actually looking at people beyond the surface. And so the challenge was associated with, everywhere you go today, look beyond the surface and look at someone until you see their soul. And I've not left my house yet today, so I can't tell you how well the challenge is going.
Right.
But to your point, it's that seeing people beyond the surface. So yes, we can see our differences, but really when we look beyond those superficial differences, there's that amazing connection that we can find with one another. And so you deal, or you work with businesses, correct?
I do.
And so why is this important? I mean, I'm a life coach. I'm an empowerment coach for women. It's an individual thing. And while they take that to wherever they go in their life, to their families, to their workplace, I don't actually work with businesses in my coaching practice. Tell me why what we're talking about right now is so important to business.
Well, I'll answer that in a couple ways. I mean, my journey into doing the work that I do now, I mean, the clients that I work with, the companies that bring me in are companies like Google and Wells Fargo and Microsoft and, all these big tech companies and finance companies, and big and small. I mean, I also work with small businesses and, nonprofits and government agencies, but the funny thing is, like, I didn't start out thinking, oh, I'm going to go work for businesses and talk to leaders and teams. It would kind of evolve that way. After my baseball career ended, I injured my arm. I was a pitcher. I was in the minor leagues with the Kansas City Royals playing pro baseball. I got hurt. I had a series of surgeries. I had to, I wasn't able to come back from that injury, which was disappointing, but I ended up back home, and home for me is the San Francisco Bay Area here in California, where I still live. And I got a job working in the tech world. And this was about 20 years ago. And one of the things that I found interesting about the very first job that I was working in sales for an internet company back in the late 90s. And I'd been fascinated by, as a baseball player, as an athlete, I love the game and I love competing, but I also was fascinated by the team dynamic, because sometimes I was on some teams where we had really good talent, but the team wasn't very good, which in sports, whether it's baseball or hockey or basketball, any sport, soccer, you would imagine if you have the best players, you should have the best team. And that's not the case. And everyone listening to us, even if you've never played at a really high level competitively, if you watch sports, sometimes the team that you root for, you think, oh, we're going to be really great this season. We have all these great players, and then their team's not very good. And it's like, I don't understand. And on the flip side, sometimes a team will come together where, the talent is okay. It's not great, but there's some kind of magic that the team has. And and I experienced this as an athlete. I've experienced this watching sports as a fan, and it doesn't make sense, but the team just kind of works. And when I got into the business world, I erroneously thought, because I spent all those years playing baseball in sports, I thought that was a sports thing. In sports, we called it chemistry.
Yeah.
No one could quite define what it was, but you knew when you had it, and you definitely knew when you didn't have it. And then when I got into business, I realized, oh, that's not a sports thing. That's a human thing. In business, we call it culture. It's basically the same thing. It's that intangible quality that either brings us together or divides us and pushes us away from one another, allows us to be successful and fulfilled or not. And it's not usually based on the talent as much as we think it is. So that's a long way of answering your question. Why these things are important at work, especially the way we work today, is that we don't get up and go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning and work hard and leave at 5 and go home. For the most part, depending on the type of work that we do, we're kind of working all the time, for better or worse. And the reality is that we spend so much of our lives, our adult lives, engaged in our professional endeavors, that if we're not doing these things and bringing these things forth into our work, it's not only having us be less effective and successful in our work, but it's probably not having us be very happy and fulfilled in our lives.
So part of what I do is I left the corporate world on a full-time basis a year and a half ago. Yes. And started my own business. But I still can't quite get out of the corporate world as it relates to team development and leadership development. Yep. So I do consulting in that area still. So what you just talk about, I am actually totally excited. It really, the way that you've created that link from your past to and brought it to present. Yeah. I feel like it's an alignment. I'm putting words in your mouth here, but an alignment of your passion, your pain. So the passion being sports, your pain being the injury, and that's come together to create what it is that you do today. And for me, when I hear someone's life coming together that way, there's nothing better.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you saying that. One thing, and you probably know this from your own journey through leaving the corporate world, and there are lots of people that do, who I meet, who start coaching businesses, who start consulting businesses, who leave and start their own company. And sometimes, look, working for a big organization, whatever the organization is, can often be stifling for us individually. It's like, well, I'm not really passionate about this. Well, there's all this bureaucracy or hierarchy or politics, and I don't like that. And look, I've traveled around the US and around in Canada and around the world inside of enough organizations to know there are a lot of really challenged, dysfunctional organizations, and there are a lot of people who are unhappy working in these places. That said, there's two things that I've learned to be true, particularly in today's world. Number one, there are a ton of businesses and companies that are really progressive and open-minded with respect to this. The podcast episode of mine that literally just released today is with a guy named Scott Shute, who is now the head of mindfulness and compassion at LinkedIn. That's his title. And he was an engineer, and then he was in customer service and sales and operations. And he's had a very successful career in the corporate world, and literally created this job on his own, because their CEO, Jeff Weiner at LinkedIn, talks a lot about compassionate leadership. And one day Scott said to Jeff, hey, you know what? We talk a lot about compassionate leadership. Why don't we implement it even more specifically in the company? Like, Scott had been the executive sponsor of their mindfulness program, but he basically pitched this idea of like, I want to be the head of mindfulness and compassion for the company, both so we can do it more internally, but also so we can speak to other companies around the world about how they make their companies more mindful and more compassionate. So again, there's a lot of really exciting things happening. The second thing I would say for anyone listening to us, even if you work inside of an organization, you say, oh, I work for the government, or I work for this organization, and it's really, really old school, and we don't talk about mindfulness or compassion. We don't talk about our own well-being. We don't talk about empowerment. We don't talk about, it's like, I have to check my soul at the door before I walk in. That is true, and there are places like that. Now, the two things I say to people when they say that to me is, number one, look, if you have an option to leave, because right now, let's knock on wood, the economy is really good and there are lots of options. So you can go other places. A few years ago, that wasn't the case. And that may not always be the case and probably won't, because the economy goes in cycles. However, the other thing that I would say is that it's really up to us to choose how we show up and engage in our work. You can leave the corporate world and start a coaching business like you have, and have a radio show and be an empowerment coach and be talking all about motivational stuff. And you can still be miserable and depressed in your work. It's not a function of the work itself. It's really a function of us. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I've been doing this for 17 years and I love my work, but it's not like rainbows and sunshine all the time. I have to generate my enjoyment and my excitement for my work. There are parts of this work, as much as I love it, that are hard, that are scary, that are stressful, that sometimes I'd rather not do, just like every job.
Absolutely.
Right? It's really up to us.
I love how you're just keeping it so real and relatable. You said a lot of things that I could explore. One of them is about choice.
Yeah.
And I just recently posted a video, a very personal kind of video on LinkedIn, talking about how I'm 43 now, but at 30, I got to a point in my life where I realized all the choices that I'd made in my life were, goals that I'd set for myself years and years before that I'd never sort of looked back on and reflected, is it still right? I finally achieved them all at 30 and I was miserable.
Yeah.
That's a devastating thing to kind of go through. And so kind of to your point, I had a few choices. I could stay where I was and just sort of and try to figure it out, or I could make some different choices. And so while that maybe I'm a slow learner, it took me 10 years to sort of figure it all out. But anyway, here I am. And we all have choices, even when we might feel like our choices aren't always ideal.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's really important. And I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think, look, our definitions of success change throughout the course of our lives, right? I mean, you think you're 43, I'm 44. It's funny, sometimes I think about it. My wife and my wife's a couple years older than I am, and we laugh about things just being in our 40s now and moving into, as we, it's just, life is funny, right? And people listening may be younger, maybe older, but it's like when I was 30, let's say, or especially when I was 20, 44 seemed old, right? Like, old people, and now it's like I'm here, and there are times, it's not that I feel like I'm a kid, but I don't feel old. And I sometimes just stop and go, wow, this is weird. Like, how did this happen? How did I get to 44 years old? And what do I think about myself and my life now related to what I thought I would feel like when I was much younger, or looking at it, and then think about my life as I move forward. How are we continually redefining and reinventing ourselves, right? And I think that's a process for all of us to go through all the time. It's kind of a moving target, if you will, and it's supposed to be. And that's one of the things that I find really exciting about life. But I think sometimes we can put ourselves into a box, or for like you accomplish a bunch of things at the age of 30 and say, well, wait a minute, is this all there is? There's got to be something else. And I love the concept that Tony Robbins talks about. It's like the science of achievement is about learning how to make things happen and generate results and success. And that's great. But then there's what he calls the art of fulfillment. And he says basically that, success without fulfillment is the ultimate failure. Mm-hmm. So if we're successful in life, and I have to check myself on this from time to time. I love my work and I get very, very focused, and I can get very accomplishment oriented. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But sometimes I'm so focused on the outcome and the result and the accomplishment, I forget, wait a minute, the whole reason that I started doing this work is because I wanted to actually really enjoy what I do and live a life that I feel is fulfilling to me, not simply just check a bunch of boxes where I hit this milestone and this goal. And I think, again, the world we live in, you mentioned it earlier with social media, and we're all looking around and, oh, look at that person, or they accomplished that, or they achieved that. We have to figure out our own sort of place of center in what really drives us and what has us be fulfilled.
Interesting. You just mentioned Tony Robbins. At the beginning of every year, I do a mind map. I'm very visual. I like mind maps. I like vision boards. And then obviously it's got to get much more granular than that, but that's where it starts.
Yep.
On my mind map for 2018, I said that I put out there that I was going to attend a live Tony Robbins event. And he's not been in Ottawa for 11 years. And who came in September? And who did I go and see in Ottawa?
Oh, you went.
Yes, Tony Robbins. So you just mentioned those two aspects of success that he refers to, and it's so simple, isn't it? When framed in that way, and very, very, very relatable.
Right. Well, if you think about that, though, we barely learn how to that science of achievement that he talks about, we don't really learn that in school. If we're fortunate enough to have mentors or parents or coaches around us, I learned a little bit of that as an athlete. But in general, again, this notion of how to really succeed or achieve at the highest level, we have to go searching for that. And if we do, sometimes we think that's the ultimate goal, right? But like you talked about, you get to 30 years old and it's like, I accomplished these things, but how come I still feel that sense of emptiness or confusion inside? Like that hole isn't filled. What is that?
Yep.
You know, sometimes again, the accomplishment, the achievement doesn't always mean money and success in our careers. It can sometimes mean relationships and, oh, I get married or I have a baby or some kind of thing that we think we're supposed to go do. And if we do that, that'll make us happy. You know, the whole notion of sort of the art of fulfillment, that's another piece that we really don't learn a lot about, and we have to go searching for, whether it's people like Tony Robbins, or people like yourself or whoever, to find, oh, how do I learn how to actually be fulfilled? You know, I learned in a really painful way about this at a very young age. I got accepted to Stanford University, where I went to school, and got to play baseball there. And Stanford's both a great school, but it's also a great baseball program. And literally from the age of like 10, I wanted to go play baseball at Stanford. So I got to Stanford. I'm in Stanford. I'm doing pretty well in school. I'm doing pretty well in baseball. My junior year at Stanford, which is like in college baseball, it's a really important year because that's the year I became eligible to get drafted by hopefully a major league team. Things are going well. I'm one of the starters on the team. I'm a pitcher. I'm doing well. I got a girlfriend that I really like. I got friends. I got all this stuff. And I become miserably suicidally depressed the middle of my junior year at Stanford. And this was something, my father had suffered from bipolar disorder, and there's a lot of mental illness in my family. So it's not something I was unaware of, at least in theory. Right. I knew what this was, but had never experienced it. I mean, I had, times where I was a little bummed out or got my heart broken when but nothing like, and it didn't even really make sense. It was sort of connected to some things, but I just found myself, I was stuck in this place I'd never been before. And thankfully, my girlfriend at the time had a counselor that she introduced me to, and then I went to the Student Health Center and I got some support. And over a few month period, thanks to some good work and some good therapy and some realization about myself and what I was going through, I was able to come through that period. But I remember being in the throes of my depression, not totally understanding. I mean, this was 1995, and people were talking more about depression and mental health at that time than they were, say, 10, 20 years prior to that, but not nearly as much as we even talk about it now, and we still need to talk about it more. But I remember thinking of being mad because I was like, wait a minute, I am winning the game. Like, I'm at a good school, I'm doing well in school and in sports, I've got friends, I've had all the external things that I was supposed to have to make sure that I was going to be happy in my life. And I was miserable. And I just remember feeling like pissed inside, like, wait a minute, this is not fair. Like, I'm literally playing.
I did everything right. I did everything right.
But then I realized it came back to, oh, this is my journey and my job to figure out how to be happy myself. It's not my mother's job. It's not my father's job. It's not my school's job. It's not my baseball team or my friends or anybody. It's not and no achievement or no accomplishment is going to do that for me. I got to do it for myself. And I also realized if I'm feeling this sense of pain and loss and fear and confusion inside of me, I can't be alone in that, even though everyone else is acting like they got it together. So this was really the start of the journey for me down that path of like, I want to figure some of this stuff out for myself and figure out how I can heal and I can grow. And if I'm able to do that, and even in a little way, I want to share that with other people.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's no question at all. I mean, the value, again, of being so open and vulnerable, and it can be difficult to do that. I think once you get used to it, I think courage is a muscle. And I too, I'm quite open in sharing the fact that when I was 16, I don't know what you actually call it, but I started bulimic tendencies. I think I'd had an eating disordered eating for many years prior to that. But, and that started my journey of exploring mental illness, health, well-being, and all of that. Yeah. And so I can relate, relate to you on a lot of what you talk about. And so how did that prepare you then for your injury? So your injury must have then come next in baseball. So walk us a little bit through this. And I'm really interested, not so much doing a Jerry Springer on the depth of the pain, because I think we can acknowledge what that feels like. But I'm really curious, like, why did you choose to move forward? How did you actually garner that strength within and move forward to create the life that you have?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the questions. I mean, it was kind of a journey. So I injured my arm initially the very first time when I was 18 years old, my senior year in high school before I get to college. So my freshman year at Stanford, I actually missed the season and had an operation on my arm. And that actually started me down the path of looking at alternative healing in a way, things like acupuncture and chiropractic and nutrition and things. Again, this is the early 90s and I'm 18, 19 years old, but my arm wasn't responding to conventional sort of Western medicine. And I started to think, oh, maybe the doctors don't have all the answers. So that started me on that path. The depression happens my junior year. I'm now 20, almost 21. I had gotten my arm healthy enough to pitch and I was doing well in baseball at Stanford. But then the depression sort of sent me down another path of looking at myself mentally, emotionally, even spiritually. Who am I? So physically, so on every level, I've been sort of rocked a bit. But baseball goes well enough. My arm is still a little sore, but I'm able to continue to pitch and compete. I get drafted by the Kansas City Royals out of Stanford that junior year that I go through that depression. I come out of both the depression and things are going pretty well for me. I'm playing pro baseball for a few years. Then at the age of 23, my third season and still in the minor leagues with Kansas City, there's a bunch of levels of professional baseball. You have to work your way to get to the major leagues. I end up getting injured where I blow my arm out completely. And at that point, the ligament in my elbow is torn. I'd also torn some cartilage in my shoulder. I have a series of surgeries over the next few years. But by the age of 25, the Kansas City Royals had released me and I wasn't able to come back from the injury. So I realized,
wow,
baseball's over. But I basically I started baseball at 7. I got hurt at 23 and then finally retired at 25. So 18 of the first 25 years of my life are focused on this one thing that I'm really good at. That's like my identity. And even when I feel my most fearful and doubtful and insecure and like nobody loves me, nobody gets me, all that, I can always lean on. I have this baseball thing to fall back on because that sort of makes me special. That makes me good, if you will. It was my science of achievement, so to speak. But then when that was taken away, I'm like, well, who am I if I'm not this person, if I'm not this athlete, if I'm not going to make it to the major leagues, and that's going to be my ticket out of, because I also grew up single mom. We didn't have a lot of money. I looked at baseball as sort of my ticket out. That was my ticket to success and to some sense of notoriety, but also a way I was going to be able to make money and support myself and hopefully give back to my mother and to my family. And all of that is completely gone. So it was a scary time.
That's a really, really scary time. And I think whether we're talking baseball or whether we're talking, for myself, it was motherhood and that waking up, I call it my awakening at 30, realizing all I am is a mom. It's what I've always wanted to be. And I've got a great house and not a great marriage, but great job, and so it is that moment of, it's a bit of a kick in the stomach or I think we can all relate to a time in our lives where we've experienced that. So what happened next then? You're sitting with that. How did you start that climb out?
Well, there was a series of things. So I moved back home to the Bay Area. I get a job, as I mentioned, working in the tech world, and I needed to get a job. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I get this job in sales and the .com boom is happening. And I figured, well, I'll figure out how to work and sell things. And, everybody, a bunch of young people in the San Francisco, Silicon Valley area were making a ton of money at that time because all these internet companies were going public. But outside of work, I had gotten really interested in, I was reading a lot of self-help and personal growth books. I went and did a seminar through an organization that at the time was called Landmark Education. And that was kind of like a Tony Robbins type thing. It was a transformational experience for me. And I loved that work and started to do a lot of seminars there and started to volunteer and get really involved in that organization because I was like, I want to figure myself out. It was similar to how I'd gone through the depression a few years earlier. I want to figure some of this out for myself. And if I can figure some of it out for myself, I'd love to be able to teach other people. I would wander into bookstores, Louise, and I would walk into the self-help sort of spiritual growth section. And I was like pulling books off the shelf that I'm thinking, this could help me, this could help me. But I also had this other funny conversation going on in my head was like, I want to do this.
Yeah.
And yeah. I read a book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff, written by Richard Carlson in early 1998.
I have that. We've followed some very similar things, actually. I've got that on my bookshelf still.
But this was right as my baseball career was coming to an end. And I read that book and thought to myself, I don't know how Richard Carlson was able to write this book or do this work, but I want to do that. I actually wrote him a letter. When I got home from spring training, I got released by the Royals that year. The end of my baseball career was becoming pretty clear to me. But I wrote Richard a letter and I said, thank you so much for this book. It really touched me. not only did it touch me personally and I got a lot out of it, it inspired me because I'd really love to do what you do. And anyway, long story short, he actually ended up writing me back a few months later in this beautiful letter because he lived locally near me in the Bay Area. And I realized I knew some people who knew him, and he said, listen, I don't know if I can offer you much, guidance specifically, but here's a few thoughts that I have is just be yourself, follow your own heart and intuition, and trust that like, if you're really meant to do this work, you'll do this work. And I kept that letter as a sign, and then started my business after getting laid off from my .com in 2000 when the .com bubble burst. I had a mentor of mine say, if you could do anything, you didn't have to worry about paying the bills, what would you do? And I said, well, I would write and I would speak and I would coach people and I would try to, help inspire people in any way that I could. And he's like, great, you should do that. And I'm like, now? And he said, yeah. And I was like, but I'm 26 years old and I don't know anything and nobody knows who I am and I have almost no experience. Like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you could wait till you think you figured it out, or you could just start now. And I ended up meeting my wife, Michelle, right around that same time. And she had started her own business. She had a staffing company at the time. And she really encouraged me. And she's like, look, starting your own business isn't easy, but it's not as hard as you think. And if you have enough passion, you could totally do it. So I started my business at the beginning of 2001. And I got some coach training at the Coaches Training Institute. Michelle actually went with me and we did the coaching training together. She ended up selling her staffing business a few years later and started her own coaching and hypnotherapy business. But so I ended up, it was pretty lean at first, but my whole goal, Louise, that first year in 2001, so this is now almost 18 years ago, was like, people were saying to me, oh, go back to school, get a degree in psychology or get a degree in organizational development if you want to work in businesses and I was like, listen, I love to learn, but I don't love school. And so what I decided was the year of 2001, I was going to take the entire year and design my own curriculum is what I called it, which meant take as many workshops as I could, read as many books, meet as many people. And at the end of the year, I figured I'd learn a bunch of stuff. And if I could somehow get this coaching and ultimately speaking and writing business off the ground, I'd hopefully make it work at least in that first year. And if not, if I'd gone to grad school, I was going to be in debt and probably be broke anyway. I figured the same thing would happen.
It's investing you into your future in a different way. And people don't often look at it that way.
Totally. And the truth was that first year was pretty lean and I did end up broke and in debt by the end, and I didn't end up with a degree in anything, but I learned a ton and I was able to, it was actually some businesses locally here in the Bay Area that were more traditional companies like Chevron and Wells Fargo and Kaiser and these companies, they were hiring people that had gotten laid off from the tech world that were about my age. And now these companies were having issues with baby boomers and Gen Xers trying to communicate and work together. And I started coming in to talk about teamwork and collaboration in the context of how can we find common ground. And I was just using some of my own insights and intuition, as well as a lot of what I'd learned as an athlete about teamwork and what makes groups actually thrive. And it's really what launched my career for me, quite frankly. And then all these years later, I joke about it too. My whole goal that first year was to try to make enough money so I didn't have to go get a real job. And I joke now with people, I'm like, well, I still haven't had to go get a real job ever since then.
I love it. So one of the things I have on my desk, I'm big on surrounding myself with the right people to keep me in the right mindset, and surrounding myself visually with things around me, with my books, the things that keep me sort of focused and inspired and motivated, not really motivated, committed, because motivation, that's it. I've got a theory on motivation, but I'm committed to doing the work even when I don't feel like doing it. Right. I don't know if you can see this.
Yes.
So those listening, you never cross the ocean unless you have the courage to lose sight of the shore is what I was just showing.
That's
Mike.
great.
And
That's
I think what you just shared is a beautiful example of that.
Yeah, I love that quote. And my good friend Karen Drucker, who's a musician who I've done some workshops with, she actually has a great song and album called Let Go of the Shore, which is basically the essence of that quote. But yeah, I mean, are we willing to let go and, put ourselves out there? It just as I continue to sort of on with my story though. And so Richard Carlson, I read that book in 98, he wrote me back. I took it as a sign, like I'm supposed to do this. Fast forward, I started my business in 2001. By 2003 now, I've got some coaching clients. I've got some businesses that are bringing me in to speak and do some things. And I have a book that I want to write that I'm trying to figure out how to get published, which I kind of learn a little bit about how you get published, but it's still, I have this book proposal. And anyway, my wife and I, Michelle and I, go to a fundraising event for a nonprofit called Challenge Day, which is a great organization, does youth empowerment programs here in the US and in Canada and around the world. We had met their founders. We had gotten a little bit involved. We show up at their fundraising event in the spring of 2003. And I look on the program as we get there a little late. We're sitting in the back of the room, and I look down, and Chris Carlson, Richard's wife, is doing the fundraising ask. And then I look up and I say to Michelle, oh my gosh, Richard and Chris Carlson are sitting up front. They're at the event.
Wow.
And a mutual friend of ours, someone who actually knew Richard, who I knew, who had been mentoring me in the book writing process, he and his wife were there as well. And I say to him, hey, I see Richard Carlson's here. Can you introduce me to him? And he said, I thought you know him. And I was like, well, I wrote him that letter back in 1998, like 5 years ago. He wrote me back, but we're not friends or anything. And he goes, well, I'll introduce you to him. So he introduces me to him after the event. And I go up to him and I say, Richard, I don't know. I'm sure you can't remember this. This was like 5 years ago, but I wrote you this letter. And blah, blah. I tell him a little bit about my story. He looks at me and goes, I remember your letter. And I'm like, are you kidding?
Wow.
Yeah. And we end up having a conversation. And in the conversation, I tell him, hey, I've been working on this book on the power of appreciation. And he says, oh, the world could really use a book on the power of appreciation, and hands me his card and says, if I can help you out in any way, let me know. And I'm like, are you kidding? So I take his card. I'm trying not to be like a total stalker. I say to Michelle, I got to wait a few days before I follow up with him. I don't want him to think I'm a freak, right? But I send him an email a couple days later, and hey, Rich. So anyway, long story short, we end up at coffee together and hit it off in this really beautiful way. And before I even ask, Richard offers to write the foreword for my book, which is not even published yet. I don't even have an agent or a publisher. And he says, I want to help you get an agent and a publisher. I want to help you get this book published. And thanks to Richard's help and his foreword and the connection to his literary agent, who ended up being my agent on my first two books, I was able to publish my first book a few years later, and Richard wrote the foreword.
What an incredible story.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the quote. I am a huge fan of quotes. When the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yeah.
And look at that right there. Incredible. There's so much there though as well about vulnerability, isn't there?
Yeah.
About being willing to ask, whether it's God, the universe, whatever it is, higher being that we believe in, and then being open to receive. Yeah. And it doesn't always come in the way. It never comes in the way that we want it to, or that we might in our minds, plan it to.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting too, I mean, as we're talking about, I'll share more of that story too, because I do think that there is, for all of us, this isn't about, people listening may be interested in publishing books or doing the kind of work that you and I do, but it's really about the things that we do want to accomplish. But as we talked about earlier, it's like, what is it we really want? What's underneath the accomplishment, whatever feeling that is? I think, if I accomplish this, I will then feel this way. Well, how about you feel that way right now, right? We can feel accomplished. We can feel proud. We can feel excited. We can feel grateful. We don't need the accomplishment. As you and I both know, and everybody listening to us, sometimes the accomplishments of things can actually be disappointing because we put so much energy into that. But if there is something that we want to accomplish, one of the things I think is important to remember is, again, like you talked about, letting go of the shore or not seeing it, is like putting ourselves out there. When I was in that journey and I met Richard and he introduced me to his literary agent and we're in the process, my book actually got rejected 25 times.
Wow.
Before we got a yes on and at the end of that process, Linda, my agent at the time, calls me, and we'd gotten rejected by all these publishers and it had gone on for quite a long time. And she says to me, listen, Mike, you're a nice guy. I know you're really passionate about this whole appreciation topic, but I don't think it's going to work. It's just, we're not. And I took her feedback. This was on a Friday, I remember. And I was really discouraged about all the no's and all the rejections and all the disappointment. And even with Richard's support and help, and with him saying, I'll write all this thing, I'm like, what else do I have to do? Like, why isn't anyone interested in this book? And it was a Friday. I talked to my wife, Michelle, over the weekend. I literally couldn't sleep. I was so upset. And I'm just like, this is so disappointing to me. And then I woke up Sunday morning that weekend and I was mad. And I remember, and I turned to Michelle, I woke her up and she wasn't super happy about it, but I said, I've been waiting, because she was actually pregnant. And I said to her, I've been waiting for someone to give me permission to write this book, whether it's my agent, whether it's some publisher, whether it's I'm waiting for some outside authority to say, you're ready, you can do this. And I was like, I'm not waiting anymore. So I called Linda up on Monday, and Linda, is this really great, and she's not my age anymore. She since is retired. She's like sort of old school, very fancy New York literary agent publisher. And I say to her on the phone, listen, Linda, I'm not waiting for your permission anymore. I don't care if I have to publish this book myself. I'm writing this book. I'm publishing this book. You know, thanks for helping me out, whatever. And I'm not, and she's like, hold on, Mike, just, you know, I know, listen, she's like, I have 3 more publishers on the list that were sort of at the bottom of the list, quite frankly, but I'm going to send it out to all 3 of them, and we'll just see. Maybe one of them's interested before you decide to do something else. I said, okay, fine. She calls me back 2 days later. She's like, Mike, you're not going to believe this. I said, what?
Oh!
all 3 of them want it. I'm like, what? How is that possible, right? It's the same proposal that got rejected 25 times. But here's the deal, and this is why this is such a universal important thing for people to get. It wasn't about the book proposal. It was about me. Something shifted in me, and I was ready. And once we're ready, the universe then does respond to us. And when I look back on it, I can honestly say I was not ready up until that moment. So there was a reason why I kept getting those no's, that once internally I was like, I'm a yes, I'm ready for this. I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen because I'm going to make it happen. Then the universe aligned in a way, and all these publishers all of a sudden were interested. And then ultimately I got a book deal and I wrote that first book.
So again, congratulations. And what this is a phenomenal story that it's not, well, it is part of your journey and your story that just showcases that need to just trust the process, which can be so difficult when you're in it. And you might be saying, oh, I'm trusting it, but you're trying to force it. You you really, truly have to live that. And so,
that's a big one.
Yeah. And so it reminds me of people who are looking for a boyfriend or girlfriend. You know, I use the air quotes there.
Right.
And that when they finally just give up, so to speak, the partner appears.
Yeah.
And so those listening right now who are saying, okay, I need to do that. I need to just let this go, whatever this is, whatever their book equivalent is.
Right.
How would you guide them to be able to move to that process of focusing less on the goal and more of the becoming? What would you say to them?
Look, I think it's a process. I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is tell the truth, right? Like if we're really attached to any particular outcome, I want a boyfriend, I want a girlfriend, I want this job, I want to move, I want, fill in the blank, whatever it is. I mean, like, look, people trying to get pregnant, right? It's like, I want to get pregnant and they're not getting, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge, God, I'm so attached to this outcome. And that's okay. We're human. There's things I want right now in my life that I'm attached to. Now, the thing we have to remember, though, is our attachment to the outcome often actually, ironically, can get in our way of allowing it to happen. And there's an interesting balance that I think is important for all of us. And so, again, this notion of surrendering doesn't mean we stop wanting, doesn't mean we stop desiring. It means that we stop holding on so tight to it has to be this way. I heard it said a number of years ago that I love this saying, this whole notion of like, if it doesn't happen, you'll be okay. And you know how you know you'll be okay? Because you're okay now and it's not happening now. You know what I mean? The person says like, I have to get into Harvard Business School or my life will be ruined. No, it won't. How do you know that? Because your life's not ruined right now and you're not in Harvard Business School. Like, relax. You know what I mean? And I don't mean to minimize it because sometimes it could be something more serious where it's like, I have this physical malady that I really want healed. Or I have this thing in my life that I really want to change and transform because it's really painful. And one of the things, there's actually a visualization and sort of meditation that I often do. And I just did it this morning, actually. I meditate in bed, by the way. I'm laying down. It's like, for years, I was always like trying to do these meditations. None of it works for me. The most comfortable and relaxing way for me to meditate is I literally wake up in the morning, I go to the bathroom, I come back, I lay down back in my bed and I meditate, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. And when I meditate, I often will visualize, and I have a few different visualization techniques. One of them is I imagine myself laying in a grass field, and then the field underneath me, so it's solid ground, it actually turns to water, but I'm totally safe, and I find myself floating, and I'm floating on my back, fully supported by the water. But the mantra, the thing that I repeat in my mind as I'm visualizing this is, I give myself permission to feel powerless.
Wow.
Just because I feel powerless doesn't mean I am powerless. So the feeling of powerlessness is different than the state of being of powerlessness. So when we allow ourselves, because one of the things most of us hate, myself included, is we hate that feeling of like, I'm powerless, I can't do anything about this. But the truth of the matter is many things in life, we are actually, there's a powerlessness built into it. And if we can actually embrace the feeling of powerlessness, the irony is it actually makes us more powerful. And I learned this in a really intense way. And my counselor, Eleanor, who taught me this technique, it was when my sister was actually dying of cancer. And it was this experience of, my sister Lori passed away in early 2016, which I write about in the introduction to Bring Your Whole Self to Work. And she was 45 when she died. And it was really, really painful. And it was really hard. And anybody who's dealt with loss, and particularly loss of someone close and someone young, knows exactly what I'm talking about. And even if you don't, you can imagine. My sister got diagnosed at 42. At the time, had a 7-year-old daughter, died at 45 when her daughter was 11. Really, really heartbreaking and awful, as you can imagine. And
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And like other experiences I've had as I've gone through loss and grief, incredibly transformational for me when I was willing to really embrace it. And part of the hardest part of it was watching my sister get sick and not being able to do anything about it. You know, because the part of me, and most of us can relate to this, I want to fix it, I want to change it, I want to do something. It's like, you know, physical life and the death of someone close to us is the ultimate reminder of, like, we're finite physical beings. This life will end at some point, which is actually a really important thing for us to realize and live with that awareness. But when I started to really embrace the powerlessness of the experience, it did not make the cancer any easier. It did not make losing my sister any easier. But what it did was it had me stop fighting within myself that somehow it was bad to feel powerless. No, exactly. That was the appropriate feeling to have in the face of that, that if I could learn how to actually embrace that feeling, ironically, even though it was painful, it was incredibly liberating and powerful. And there are so many things in life. We're not usually facing the death of our sibling or someone really close to us, thankfully. But we are often facing a lot of circumstances and situations, even when it's something we want that's positive, like a goal, like a relationship, like some kind of accomplishment. But if we're unwilling to embrace that uncomfortable feeling of powerlessness, we actually move into the state of being of powerlessness, which renders us almost ineffective to do anything. So it's true about most emotions. If we feel the feeling, we're liberated. If we stay stuck in the state of being, of fear, of anger, of sadness, then we're in trouble. But feeling sad, not a problem. Feeling scared, not a problem. Feeling angry, not a problem. If we actually feel it and move through it. If we get stuck in the state of being, you walk around angry all the time, that's a state of being that's not very enjoyable for us or the people around us. You walk around scared all the time, like the state of being of fear, you're not going to manifest and attract positive things to you. You walk around in the state of being of sadness, that's going to create a life experience. But if you allow yourself to feel sad when you feel sad, feel angry when you feel angry, feel powerless when you feel powerless, that's actually incredibly liberating and powerful.
I would really like just to pause for a moment. I really would love you to repeat what you just said about feeling the emotion and moving forward. Can you just repeat that really slowly? Because if nothing else, I would love for my listeners to be able to take that away from today.
So basically, I'll say it this way as a way to repeat, but emotions are energy. We consider them positive or negative, right? We love to feel love and joy and happiness and gratitude, and we don't usually love to feel sadness and anger and disappointment and jealousy, the ones we consider bad. But the truth of the matter is there's a difference between feeling a feeling and being in a state of being. The feeling of sadness, the feeling of anger, the feeling of fear, actually really powerful and empowering if we feel it and move through it. The example that I love to use is, think when we get really sad and we get so sad that we allow ourselves to just cry, and you have a really good cry about something that you feel really sad about. Do you notice that after you cry, you feel really good?
Once my headache is gone, I do. Yeah.
I mean, it has, it's not that magically, if I'm crying about something that's a sad experience in my life, again, the loss of someone or something, the experience didn't change. The thing is still there. But when we allow ourselves to really feel and express the emotion intensely, the emotion moves through us, and we're no longer in that state of being that grips us and holds us, called sadness. It's often liberating. You ever cry so hard that you end up laughing?
Yeah.
Right? So it's the same thing. Or have you ever gotten really angry at someone, like someone that you love, and you just say, I'm really angry, and you express your anger, and then you're like, okay, I'm good now.
Yeah.
What do we teach our children? Like, use your words or cry it out. Or we just like, we do that with our kids. And then some point, I don't know if it's 16, 18, 22, at some point in life, we're supposed to like have it together. But in reality, what there is for us to do is allow ourselves to feel the feelings. And when we feel the feelings, they move through us, and we actually can pull the energy from the feeling and use it to our advantage. fear isn't the problem. It's the denial of fear. We often stay in a fearful or anxious place when we're unwilling to allow ourselves to feel fear. So back to your question about someone really wants something. I have this goal. I really want to fall in love and meet someone. I really want to write a book. I really want to move and start a new career. What's the thing about that is it's scary. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's vulnerable. I might go for it and fall flat on my face. I might get my heart broken. I might just embarrass myself miserably. And that's all real. So we got to acknowledge the fear of that. But like you said in that beautiful quote, we can't really take that adventure if we're still tied to the shore. We have to be willing to let go and acknowledge this feels really scary. I literally feel like I want to throw up. And you know what? I'll be okay. Like, we've all done scary things before and we survived. Sometimes they turned out great and we got the great results. Sometimes we failed miserably and we fell flat on our face. Either way, we're still here.
Yeah, it's amazing. Another commonality we have, although the outcome was different. My sister was sick for 5 years and had a bone marrow transplant. Thankfully for us, unlike you, we had a good outcome.
That's great.
I, for 5 years, really was feeling awful every single day. And I read a poem, which I can't recite the whole thing because I can't recall it all, but it was something like, come to the edge, I can't, I'm afraid. Come to the edge, I can't, I will fall. Come to the edge, she came, and then she flew. And my sister actually got that tattooed on her body because I wrote it in a card for my sister. I said, this is the first thing I've read that has actually allowed me to feel free and be able to live with the pain that is our life right now. It didn't stay stuck and contained.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate your openness in sharing the message that you shared. So we have 4 minutes left. I just had the opportunity to say, if there's one thing my listeners go away with, it's about feeling the emotion and trusting the process.
Yep.
If you have one thing for my listeners to walk away with, what would that be and how can they reach you?
You know, when you asked that question, the story just popped into my head. My wife and I, Michelle, we have 2 girls, Samantha, who's 12, and Rosie, who's 10. And I remember a piece of advice I got from a mentor and teacher and counselor of mine when Michelle was pregnant with Samantha, who's now 12, almost 13. He said to me, Mike, you know, the most important job you have when your daughter is born is to teach her how to love herself. And I'd gotten lots of advice, as you often do, as you know, when you're about to have a baby, especially your first. And no one had given me any advice like that. And I was struck by it. And I said to him, his name's Chris. I said, Chris, how do I do that? He said, you love yourself and you let her see that.
Wow.
That's how you teach her how to love herself. And I think one of the greatest gifts we can give to all the people around us, and obviously to ourselves, is to learn how to be more loving and kind and compassionate to ourselves.
Wow.
And that's a practice. Not an easy one from my experience and most people I know, but it's a really important one.
And would you say that meditation is part of that practice for you? Is allowing yourself and giving yourself that time and that space and that quiet stillness?
Absolutely. Meditation, journaling, being real. Again, allowing myself to feel my emotions. Loving ourselves doesn't mean we're perfect all the time. It doesn't mean we have to necessarily look in the mirror and say, I'm beautiful and I love myself and I'm great. Sometimes we feel like that. Sometimes we feel like crap and we don't want to say those things. It's giving ourselves space to have all of that and be okay with who we are and how we are in all the given moments of our lives.
So I could talk to you all day long and I would love to be able to do that for our listeners, but our time is coming to a close. I do know that you have your most recent book published. I'd love to hear the name of it. Remind us of the name of it, please, and how people can get their hands on a copy of that.
The newest book is called Bring Your Whole Self to Work. And the best place to get the book or get in touch with me and my work is at mike-robbins.com, which is my website.
And if you didn't get that website, friends, you can get that from mine. I will have Mike's contact information in the show notes. And so, Mike, thank you so very much for sharing your soul, your heart, and your time with all of us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And of course, I want to thank all of you, my loyal listeners, followers, and remind you that later today, the link to this podcast can be found on my website, louisehreed.com. As I always do, want to express my deepest gratitude to my producer at Contact Talk Radio Network, Cameron Steele. And as I always do at this time, I would like to thank you for all of your time, for all of your support, and encourage all of you to be brave, be bold, and be happy. Until next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm Louise H. Reed, wishing you an amazing day. Goodbye, friends.